these Sakhalin-1 and Sakhalin-2 projects. And the second category is the finalizing project plan, that is a Trans-Siberian oil pipeline. And thirdly, Northeast Asia gas pipeline system may be still in the conceptual stage. Among them, the Trans-Siberian pipeline is most important strategically and geopolitically. Russian people call it as Pacific pipeline, expressing the historical desire of the nation. However, as the Pacific Ocean is seen in east of Japan, I will call it Trans-Siberian pipeline. And this shows how the Sakhalin projects are seen, but you know them already. And this is the proposed route plan for the pipelines from eastern Russia to the Pacific coast, namely Japan, Korea, and China. Skip it. And the outline of Trans-Siberian oil pipeline, it is about 4,000 kilometer pipeline to the Pacific coast. And with the 2,500 kilometer western section should be upgraded at the same time. There are various calculations on the pipeline construction cost. As a ballpark figure, the total cost will be within $10 billion, including the upgrading of the existing section from the West Siberian fields to Angarsk. This shows how oil and gas export is important for Russia. And nextly, this shows the expectation of the future Russian oil production. On average, it is projected to reach 500 million tons in year 2010. Of course, the forecasts have a big variance as shown in this chart. I do not elaborate in this. And next, this shows the situation of Northeast Asian energy supply, and also the projection of the Northeast Asian energy consumption. Skip this. And the background of the current energy consumption in Northeast Asian countries. And the chart on the right hand shows, the yellow part shows the share of the Middle East crude oil imported into Japan, Korea, China. About 3/4 of the region's oil imports comes from the Middle East. And this is the forecast of the oil balance in the Northeast Asia. The bottom part shows the Japanese oil consumption, which will be leveling off in between 2000 and 2010. And Korea's petroleum consumption is going to increase a little bit more than the current level, but the absolute quantity would not be very much substantial. The question is how big would be the Chinese oil consumption. Dark green part shows the Chinese domestic crude oil production. In this chart, I projected it's around 150 million tons for year 2020. On the other hand, the light green part shows the Chinese oil imports, where I projected that the petroleum consumption of China in 2020 will be over 450 million tons a year. So the balance, 300 million tons will be necessary for import. But according to recent hearings from newly formed National Development and Reform Commission, NDRC, the former SDPC, is they are considering more conservative here in this is drafting of the 11th five-year plan starting in year 2006, controlling its petroleum consumption in year 2020 from 450 to 401 or 400 million tons a year, and at the same time increasing domestic oil production from 150 or 170 million tons to 200 million tons. Then such a projection will narrow the import gap from 300 million tons to 200 million tons in year 2020. Should this ambitious plan be materialized, however, China's oil import still needs to be tripled by 2020. Overall, looking at the energy trend in Northeast Asia, the oil market in Northeast Asia will develop further in the coming decades, and the region needs additional import sources to secure necessary supply. And on the Russian part, Russia needs reliable outlet of its oil and gas exports to sustain its economic development. Here, important implications are that developing Siberian oil and gas resources for the Pacific market will bring additional and important security to the Northeast Asian countries, as well as development of Eastern Russia that is strategically important for the internal politics of the country. From this observation, the Trans-Siberian Pipeline can be a win-win project for all the parties concerned if economically viable. And it should be designed in a sufficiently large scale to materialize the expected benefits. I think the benefits of the Trans-Siberian Pipeline is great, but there are substantial challenges to be overcome. In spite of substantial challenges, I think we can find solutions as stated later. While major challenges are, firstly, insufficient crude oil reserves are found to date in Eastern Siberia, and secondly, huge fund is required to implement the project, and the long-distance pipeline tariff would be prohibitively high. The benefits. Major benefits of the pipeline will be, firstly, to improve energy security of Northeast Asia, and secondly, to develop economy of Eastern Russia and trade with Northeast Asian countries, especially should all energy projects in Eastern Russia be materialized. Oil exports to Northeast Asia from Russia may exceed 2 million barrels per day, and natural gas export 50 billion cubic meters per year, which are negligibly small at present. Secondly, energy investment in Eastern Russia will exceed $50 billion, which will become a strong driving force to develop the region that is left behind economic and social development. Thirdly, export amounts from Russia to Northeast Asia will increase by over $20 billion a year from the current 100-something level, enhancing trade ties in the region. On the other hand, major challenges are supply source. Firstly, crude oil reserves found in East Siberia would be insufficient to feed the 2 million barrels per day large-scale pipeline, and developing them will take longer time because of harsh conditions without proper infrastructure. Technical issues relating to permafrost and handling of associated gas are yet to be solved on the discovered fields. say 8 to 10 years may be necessary before we see production from the discovered fields. For those fields yet to be found, at least 15 years will be necessary, considering acreage bidding procedure and seismic acquisition operation that is confined to winter season only. Secondly, economics and funding. A huge fund is required to implement the project, and the long-distance pipeline tariff is anticipated to be prohibitively high. However, these issues can be solved if human wisdom should be collectively mobilized by the countries of the region. To this end, government initiative is extremely important. Talking about the oil reserves of Siberia, oil resources discovered in East Siberia, though not proven yet, are deemed to be about 10 billion barrels, which compares to 1 million barrels per day supply for 30 years. This is just half of the 2 million barrels per day of the proposed pipeline capacity. According to a recent report by JNOC, 20 billion barrels have been already located. More may be discovered if additional exploration were carried out. However, these resources need further confirmation and verification before development. As a result, it is necessary and appropriate to consider introduction of the Western resources in Russia into the system, especially in the beginning. Considering the foregoing circumstance, I would like to propose a couple of two-stage approaches to the pipeline project. Firstly, the oil supply system should be designed to start with the West Siberian crude oil first. East Siberian crude will take time to come into the system and should be considered as supplemental in the later stage of the project. Construction of the pipeline would provide good circumstances to enhance the oil exploration in Eastern Siberia as well. Secondly, the system should also be designed clarifying roles of the government and private sectors. It should be constructed under the government initiative first, and the market mechanism can be applied for its operation through auction of the tariff. Since contemporary corporate accounting system cannot incorporate the great social benefit of the project, investment evaluation by virtue of business consideration would be much lower than the real value of the project. At the same time, various issues need to be coordinated internationally in implementing the project. Hence, the government role is very much important in the initial stage. In designing the project, however, inefficiency of politics and bureaucracy should be carefully avoided. To elaborate further on the economics, it is important to note that the financial fee, namely interest on borrowing, profit, and tax on the profit, is substantially greater than the technical costs required for construction and operation. Assuming the return on equity investment at 12% after tax as a private sector investment threshold, the financial fee would be 1.5 to 3 times greater than the technical cost, namely CAPEX and plus OPEX. The latter is calculated at around $1 per barrel, as you see in this chart. All the way from the West Siberia to the Pacific coast. Assuming the total investment at $10 billion, I think this amount is sufficient to recover the necessary investment. And annual operation cost for 30 years at $10 billion again and 2 million barrels per day transportation, or total 20 billion barrels for 30 years. This will be sufficiently competitive to the current pipeline tariff to the European market, that is around $2 per barrel. However, considering that crude oil price is hovering around $25 and Russian oil production costs around $10, or even considering $15 for development of East Siberian frontier fields, all companies may be willing to pay more than $1. Government can just kick off the project and later on auction the pipeline tariff to obtain more reasonable one through market mechanism. In addition, if a subsidy is given, the projected threshold can be lowered further. In summary, government initiatives to kick off the project is of paramount importance. I would like to summarize my report. Firstly, the pipeline will enhance energy security of Northeast Asia and will be a powerful driver for regional economic development. Secondly, government initiative is essential for project implementation. In setting out policy action, securing the huge fund and lower threshold. In doing this, I propose that the pipeline should be constructed under government initiative, save that market mechanisms should be applied in its operation, and the upstream and downstream businesses should be let open to the private sector. Providing coherent implementation mechanisms is also necessary, and it is a role of the government, I think. Thirdly, as such, it is important to clearly separate and recognize roles of government and private sectors. The role of government is to create a platform for the private sector to positively act on market mechanisms. Overall, our ultimate objective is to materialize a real and stable flow of energy into the Northeast Asia. At present, however, we see confrontation between Japan and China over the Russian oil. Should one party win, it would cause a vicious circle developing into fierce and reckless competition elsewhere in other parts of the world. However, if the region is successful to find mutually beneficial solution, that will provide a valuable precedent developing into a positive and prosperous cycle, and the cost of such a detour would be negligibly small. The pipeline implies a great social benefit to the region and is economically viable. I do not say commercially, but economically viable. Nations of Northeast Asia, including Russia, should get together to discuss to confirm this and resort to the best interest of the region. As a pragmatic measure for materialization, I have proposed to you two-step approaches for a serious consideration of all consideration and all the parties having interest in this project. Finally, this chart shows how the world looks from strategic locations of Russia. It looks quite natural that developing the eastern vector of Russia closely relates to Northeast Asia, a promising energy market of the 21st century. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Our next presenter is Dr. Zhou Zhu, who has worked with CNPC and has his own consulting company and has worked on many Baker Institute projects.
Thank you, Amy. I doesn't have a slide show up, but I do working with CNPC, China National Petroleum Corporation. Today, I will talk about the China-Russia Energy Corporation. Mainly is focus on the pipeline routes. I will simply show my straight source. Given the time limited, I will put my conclusion first. My straight idea or observations from based on our study in Beijing can be summarized into the 4 points. Number one, pipeline to Daqing and then to continue down to the Darling seaport should be built first based on feasibility studies by both China and Russia. Both countries will benefit each other in the near future. Second point is China also recognizes and should be happy to see the evident significance of the pipeline to Nahudaga port to target the Asia or Asia-Pacific market, essentially Northeast Asia as a whole. I emphasize this because China finds itself no way to dominate the Russian oil. China will benefit from that line, to Nahudaga as well. 3. China will also like to join the oil and gas E&P activities in eastern Siberia, especially along the line. This will contribute to economic development in eastern Siberia and Far East. However, China has not worked out a practical strategy yet, facing the hardship of the investment climate in Russia. Fourth, or last point is, we are now seriously working on the energy issues about utilization of Russian oil and constructive relationships with Russia. Of course, every country has different strategic interests and priorities, especially some issues relating to the energy security. However, the cooperation or coordination, in my views, after our study, are easily to be talked or discussed, but both cooperation or coordination will be never easily made on some strategic energy issues. Competition is always overwhelming. So I find it is time for all parties involved to sitting down to working together on some strategic issues, including the pipeline from Russia to China or even to Asia as a whole. This is some very straight idea or observation from my point of view. Now let me explain a little bit more views related to the Russia or cooperation with Russia discussed today. I have some point. Firstly, regarding Russian energy strategy to the 2010, just we discussed this afternoon, we share the similar views with other experts here, especially those Russian open policy or strategy. However, based on my study of the Russian fusion open policy, first of all, I think export or oil export is the mainstream of Russian policy, with intent to capture world market, especially non-European market, including USA and Russia. Therefore, increase domestic production, debottlenecking outlets, especially pipeline, and capture global market for bigger market share are integrated component of the Russian outward strategy, and will prioritize anyway in the future. This is first point about Russian energy strategy. to the 2010. We done study on that. We also translate the document into Chinese and organize the team working on that. Secondly, foreign direct investment in Russia, especially in the upstream area, will be less encouraged by Russia and will limit it to some, or several frontier areas, including Sakhalin, Timanpetla, northern area within the Caspian Sea, within the Russian territory, or some others, including Palan Sea, where Russian oil companies are not afforded to explore or develop it by themselves so far. Overall, the open up of the oil industry in Russia is less possible, impossible, given Putin's primary strategy and the Russian oil majors' view. So therefore, acquisition or merger with the Russian company is one way available for international majors to make direct investment in Russia safely and practically in the future, just like did by BP, or maybe the future, in the near future, or some deal will be done between Exxon and the UCOS, just reported. China now, China actually is not an early bird in Russia, although it's bordering with Russia. However, recently China experienced a lot, and witnessed its failures by dealing with Russia, with both Russian government and the oligarchs, including I just mentioned when I raised a question to experts here. China failed to bidding for Slaveneft, and the pipeline from Russia to China is also, troubled a lot, and some ENDP project in Russia also doesn't come out so far. We realized the importance of the long-term relationship and or close cooperation with both Russian government, or especially federal government, including local ones, and oligarchs. We also realized the different role played by government and oligarchs in upstream, downstream, because different rule in upstream with midstream. We found out hardship dealing with Russia. To be free from hardship, we have to study on Russian energy strategy in detail. We have to know more about Russian rule again. I just mentioned, we find the Russian oil player also have a different rule with the internationals. We have to figure out what's the rule of the game in Russia. The game, played by both government or the oil companies or oligarchs. They have different behaviors or cultures, and also have different mentalities regarding strategic, partnership with other countries, including China. Finally, I would like to exchange some my views of the competition between China and Japan for the same source of oil from Russia a little bit. My basic views has been expressed at the beginning of my talk, regarding the pipeline. Competition between two countries is very, understandable because of the diversification of the importing oil by both countries. And both countries, for sustainable development in the future, they have to looking for the additional source, especially a major additional source from the outside of the Middle East. The source of oil make a great deal of sense to both China and Russia. So the two countries share the same strategy of the diversifications. Now, what we have to do, exchange now is, how to cooperate, coordinate each other. Japan has done a lot about regional energy cooperations. Also, have lots of suggestions, to China or neighboring other countries using the region, about regional energy cooperation. We now have to focus on practical issues, step by step, politically and economically, by taking in account of the short-term strategy, short-term benefit, and the long-term development to the benefit for all the countries in the region. Thank you.
Okay, next we have the view from the U.S. Ms. Candy Green is here from the U.S. Department of State and has fluent in Russian and a good background on that part of the world. So, Candy, please.
I'm going to keep going with the trend to stay away from the screen. The State Department is famous in government circles for not doing bullets and projections, so I have instructions just to talk to you. I'm here from the Office of Energy Affairs, but I want to underline first, as we've seen today, as we've heard from everybody, that as I talk about our policy on pipelines in the former Soviet Union, that it fits in a much broader context, of course, both domestically in those countries as they're making their decisions about handling this sector, but also in terms of U.S. policy and where it fits in there. So I want to just talk for a minute about the broader context, both in terms of overall energy and our goals in the area, and the other ways this relates to policy, before I sort of focus in on pipelines, because in some ways, pipeline policy is a concise story. And I'm going to try to finish very quickly so that we can be sure to make our dinner at time and that Amy doesn't kill me when we're late for the bus. So in terms of the general context, of course, talking about Russia and again, all the other countries of the former Soviet Union where we're looking at key producer or transit roles. Our policies are, of course, part of our national energy policy, which, looking purely at the energy point of view, is trying to encourage sustainable growth in hydrocarbon production. I want to underline sustainable because there's some concern about whether growth, particularly in Russia, is sustainable given current environments and investment levels. And with an idea, of course, it's not just growth in production, but increased export flows that come out of that. The increased export flows from both Russia and the Caspian obviously will increase global energy diversity of supply. And in our view, any of that oil that comes into the market internationally, wherever that goes, increases U.S. energy security and that of our allies. So that, I think that in a nutshell is really what the focus of energy policy is about. But there's a lot of other goals that are there, and there are ways that we're trying to accomplish that, and pipelines fit into those broader goals. To underline what I just said, though, we recognize very much it's not that this oil or this gas has to come to the U.S. And I think sometimes people, whether they're foreign companies or foreign governments, or even people in the domestic audience, will look at our policy and say, the U.S. is just out there to grab more oil. It's got to come here, and that's what we're after. And that, of course, is not entirely the case. It's not specifically the case. It's a fungible commodity, obviously, some more transportable than others, but we recognize very much that Russia and the Caspian are much closer to a lot of other markets than here. So we're not always entirely altruistic, but I think in this case, there's a lot of larger goals. How do we try to encourage that sustainable growth and increased export flows? Of course, trying to encourage an investment climate that's more favorable to investment in the sector. That's to both foreign and domestic investment. This applies to pipelines, again, just as well, to encourage increased transparency, competition, demonopolization, privatization, openness, and respect for rule of law, contract sanctity. That's sort of the catchwords that we all know, but this is very much a part of what our dialogue is with Russia, with Kazakhstan, with Azerbaijan. Obviously, different points have different precedence, different urgency in certain areas. We try, of course, we're not altruistic in trying to support U.S. commercial opportunity. That's a part of U.S. government policy. Whether that's through direct investment, whether it's through cooperation, whatever the venues, we're trying to help create a level playing field, or at least to open up some doors so there's at least a chance at an uneven playing field. Looking at the larger sphere in Russia as well as these other countries, obviously energy and the use of the funds that are generated by the development of energy resources have a huge role to play in the political and economic, the social development of countries. So in trying to encourage sustainable Russian growth of production and exports, we're also looking very much at trying to help the development of factors that will contribute to those kinds of growth and democratization and stability. The same thing would go in other places. So moving on to a more specific discussion of the individual areas, I'm going to focus primarily on Russia, the Caspian. I'm going to talk about Ukraine a little bit because of some decisions that are being made today that are very foremost in terms of policy and impact on future developments. And talk about gas. Gas obviously has relevance to all parts of this. I'll just have a shorter discussion focusing more on Gazprom. In Russia, of course, the questions of opening up the transport systems, both oil and gas, to competition is a key one. Encouraging a commercial attitude in the area, trying to help them understand that privatization, private involvement in the sector, commercialization can help make this future development, eliminating the export bottlenecks, be accomplished more quickly and more efficiently and with greater benefit to the government. As you open up and you allow more oil out and gas out, as you make this more efficient, it's a benefit to everybody. As you might guess, that argument is not always a successful one. And as people have mentioned today earlier, what's happening in terms of Russian government actions and pronouncements has shown a trend back towards, some people might call statism, whatever it is, to re-seize to the extent possible, or to exercise increased leverage in some way over the flow of dollars and control of the natural resources. But it doesn't mean we don't keep making the points about Transneft, specifically about Gazprom as well, and in general about the principles of free and equal access in transport networks and commercial participation and transparency. We try to encourage an attitude that respects the commerciality of this involvement and doesn't tend to use these resources and their export and their transit as a political lever or as a commercial lever in a way that ends up being unfair in terms of neighbors. That's an issue that's quite delicate, and it's quite hard to analyze a lot of the time. But there have been a number of actions that cause people to be of concern, and we're trying to watch closely to see what's happening in the policies of both governmental, quasi-governmental, and private sector companies in Russia and the activities of their neighbors, and the involvement of the energy sectors of their neighbors. We try to accomplish these goals primarily through the energy dialogue with Russia, which probably most people in this room are familiar with. I won't go into much detail. Second Commercial Energy Summit was held in September in St. Petersburg. It's a formal framework for a lot of contact and discussion that goes on in a number of foreign at high levels. The Secretaries of Energy and Commerce have frequent contact with their Russian counterparts, less frequent but also regular contact with Caspian nation counterparts. There's a commercial dialogue going on, which we support, commercial dialogue under the structure of the energy dialogue between Russian and U.S. commercial companies, which has just made a number of recommendations to the governments, both governments, on ways to remove the obstacles to future cooperation, and we're looking at those and trying to encourage our government counterparts in Russia as well to look at them and consider how those would be possible to implement. So moving more specifically to pipelines, the ultimate goal really being to encourage an expansion of that network in an efficient way. The transportation costs that are posed by the alternatives to pipelines are going to become much more of an impediment, obviously, as global oil prices go down again. Russian oil exports have been able to move up because of these prices, even though the transportation bottlenecks remain in the pipelines. And how long that situation is going to hold is anybody's guess. We have not been promoting or advising specific routes. I think if you ask me to talk about what pipeline policy is, I mean, and we want to talk about a specific area that's focused on today, the U.S. government position on pipelines and pipeline development is the more oil that gets out, the better that is. Where the Russians choose to send that and how they choose to send that is up to them in their negotiations with other countries, with other companies. Obviously, there's geopolitical considerations at stake, but from a U.S. government point of view, it's one, we probably wouldn't have much impact, and two, it's not our position. I'll be happy to take more questions on that, but that's short and sweet what the policy is in that area of the world. There's talk in other areas of other specific projects, Murmansk, with the terminal involved, the pipeline, of course. There have been statements welcoming that from a government point of view at the summit in St. Petersburg. The Russians, both privately particularly, continue to express very strong interest in developing Murmansk. Obviously, what happens with that project is closely tied in to the fate of the relationship between Transneft and the private companies, and Transneft's own goals and the Russian government's goals for where its oil moves and how it moves out. But as I said, we would welcome Murmansk, but there's not a U.S. government effort underway to roust up billions of dollars to make that happen. We're not out there knocking on doors, beating them down, saying, make this happen tomorrow. We would welcome it. We are encouraging openness, again, to private investment. We'd like to see if this happens, that there's openness to foreign investment, or at least equal access for foreign companies to get their oil out as well through this pipeline. Just to touch lastly one more time on Transneft, I think it's important to say that it's not, the government policy on our part is not to destroy Transneft, to take it down. We're just trying to encourage the Russian government to look at ways to open up the system, to involve private participation as a way that we have found in our experience is a way to get things done better and faster, and something that's going to last longer. A concern, of course, related to this and to general trends, as I said before, is Russian involvement and what the attempts are to use levers. Would Transneft continue to be, would it be a lever sometimes abroad? Is it more reliable to have a private-owned oil company, oil transport network, or even just a pipeline? Generally, the Russians have been extremely reliable suppliers in both oil and gas, but the cutoff of Russian oil shipments through Ventspils, through crude oil shipments through Ventspils in Latvia this year raised some eyebrows, I think, not just here, but as other people looked around at the question of political involvement in commercial operations. Turning to the Caspian, our policy continues to be basically housed under the umbrella of multiple export pipelines are good. We've been involved very strongly, and to an extent that really is different from our pipeline policy generally of not getting involved in routes or commercial decision-making. It's certainly well known that we were very involved in making the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline happen. We're still very involved in seeing that as it's begun construction, that it gets to the end and that it's able to operate. As many of you probably know, there's going to be decisions on financing made this week coming up at the World Bank. I think the EBRD's decision is going to be in a couple of weeks, but the U.S. continues to be very closely involved in trying to facilitate completion of this project and then success over the years as it goes forward. CPC expansion is something that the U.S. government has supported and has talked to the Russians about, has been involved in discussions and helping to facilitate through good offices and support. We have also been involved in trying to help bring Kazakh oil into the BTC pipeline once it exists, and facilitating discussions on that between Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. And in the same area, breaking away to look at gas briefly, the Shah Deniz discovery and the potential for shipments of gas into Europe from the Caspian from Shah Deniz is something that we've been trying to support, to see a parallel pipeline for gas that would go out and move through Turkey, and a Turkish-Greek interconnector on gas is something that would be welcomed. The key for Shah Deniz, of course, is getting a market for that gas and trying to find a niche for it in Europe, and the timing issues that are involved, and the question of demand and supply ratios as we look forward a few years is going to be critical. But the US government has been encouraging European allies to look at Caspian gas, talking to the people who would be trying to sell it about opportunities. And the reason behind this rather micromanagement level of involvement in the Caspian continues to be our view that multiple export pipelines from the area support the independence, sovereignty, and the economic development of the countries of the area. And that's really the bottom line. Will Caspian oil ever make it to the United States? I mean, that's hard to say. Probably not. But in our view continues to be that the addition of pipelines in the area, those countries' abilities to operate those and move their energy resources to market is an important geopolitical goal. But as the BTC is underway, financing decisions to come, but with construction in train and scheduled to finish on time, the late 2004, early 2005. Our focus now is also the larger picture in the countries of what these oil revenues will mean. So as we talk about our pipeline policy, we have to now also say, of course, what's going to happen in these places with those oil revenues? Will governments use them wisely? Will they be used to expand social development and economic development across multiple sectors? What will it mean in terms of education? So we're working with the governments. We're watching. We're trying to encourage the wise use of these resources. We're working with the companies involved to look at ways to increase the benefits they're bringing in and to work in the communities along the lines of the pipelines and elsewhere. In Ukraine, decisions are, just about every day I get a call saying, quick, look at these points. They're going to make a decision tomorrow. And that's been going on for a few weeks. But Odessa-Brody and what happens to the Odessa-Brody pipeline is of interest to us. And the efforts by Russian companies, BP, TNK, others, Russian efforts to reverse the pipeline, or whether the pipeline remains in its as originally conceived and eventually transports Caspian oil in the near future out into European markets, is something that we'd like to see happen. We're hoping not to see the pipeline reversed, and that's because of our concerns about Ukraine and our view that using the pipeline as originally envisioned will support the increased diversity of energy supply for Ukraine too, and will help contribute to its own development. There's not very much that I can say specifically about gas in terms of Ukraine, other than the fact that if we're talking about pipelines in the former Soviet Union, Ukraine's role as a transit country is critical. And what happens in terms of transparency or the lack thereof there, in terms of the management of that sector, and how those funds and those pipelines are used in their relationship with Russia and with Europe is obviously very important. And we're continuing to encourage in Ukraine, as we do elsewhere, those same watchwords of transparency, commerciality, rules of the game, rule of law, contract sanctity. And lastly, to just look at the gas issue writ large in Russia and Gazprom. Obviously, if we're talking to Russia about encouraging reform, demonopolization, privatization, transparency, the elephant in the closet is Gazprom. And naming that elephant sometimes, or not naming it and talking more in general, it's always a part of what the U.S. policy and U.S. advocacy is. That said, I don't think there's a lot of progress there. And it doesn't look like there's going to be progress soon. I mean, as Martha said, as other people have said here, looking at what's happening in Russia, there's clearly a very a lot of thought being given at the government level to natural resources and assets and control of those assets. And the statements that have been made lately about Gazprom and about Transneft as well suggest that they're not going to be letting go anytime soon. We've seen Gazprom clawback. We've seen clawback of assets. It's one of my favorite terms in energy, clawback, talking about Russia. So as Gazprom has taken back assets, as Rosneft and others try to get control over other fields that are lucrative that people have control, it's of concern. What it means for the larger sector, what it means for the country overall, is something that's of concern. Again, looking at the actions that may have political connotations or may not, but have political consequences, what Gazprom does in its commercial dealings with countries around the periphery is something that we're watching. The Central Asia, the buy-up of Central Asian gas reserves, and what happens with that. Of course, a deal is only good on the paper it's written on for today. How many of those deals are going to be implemented over the 20-year period is open to question. But if we're talking about pipelines and we're thinking about gas, what happens to Central Asian gas and how it moves to market, whether Central Asian gas and control over that enables Russia to delay its own reform efforts, its own openness to private investment in reform, is I think a question that's at the top of the list. And I'd just like to close in seconding something also Martha said earlier, that the biggest threats to Gazprom, I think, are going to be the Russian oil producers. I mean, what we say about it, what others outside say about it, will have less impact potentially, I think, and are less concerned to the Russian government, individuals making the decisions than as Russian private pressure to have a chance at getting their hands on the ability to export some of that, to monetize that. And so I will stop so we can get to dinner on time. And we're going to do questions just again and again. Is that right? Thanks.
Okay, so we can have questions on all of the presentations from the segment on pipelines or additional comments. Oh, after lunch session, not one's lively.
Yeah.
Peter?
I have a couple of questions for Mr. Kanekio. Yes. First one is, you're talking about the pipeline auctioning off the pipeline capacity.
Yes.
And my question is, how many competitors would there be in such an auction? So you've got one pipeline, limited capacity, but if there's sort of single buyer at one end or single seller at the other end, the auction may not be very effective. So that's the first. Maybe you can answer that one.
Mm-hmm. The total capacity of the pipeline is 2 million barrels per day.
Right.
There cannot be a single supplier or single buyer. So the auction is quite a reasonable option, I think.
So how many do we think there would be though?
Say, on the buyer side, in Japan we have 5, 6 oil companies,
Right.
Koreans 4, 5 companies,
Okay.
Chinese 3. And maybe others from the ASEAN countries or even the traders can join it.
Right.
And on the supplier side, you see there are so many Russian companies operating, Lukoil, Yukos, and so on.
Okay. My second question was, you made the comment that the social benefits,
Mm-hmm.
the pipeline would greatly exceed the commercial return.
Yes.
And I guess I can think of you would think that the revenue that the company gets might represent at least the marginal value to the buyer.
Mm-hmm.
And one could think of the project having employment benefits, but presumably that's reflected in the wages of the people you employ.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I can imagine that there may be, I can think of two reasons why the social benefits might exceed the revenue. But I think it's useful to think about it because I think it has different implications. So here's my suggestion was, I mean, there could be spillover benefits, you know, so in the form of, you imagine sort of you have economic development in Siberia, it raises land values or whatever, or maybe provides taxes for social economic development and so on. But another argument as to why the benefits might exceed the revenue is that because of the huge fixed costs.
Yes.
If you have to charge a price to recover all the fixed costs,
Yes.
The amount of product that you'd be selling would not be very great. On the other hand, if you charge, if you use the pipeline, so you charge marginal cost because of the huge fixed costs, you couldn't cover all your costs. So I guess the reason why I think it's important to think about why the social benefit would exceed the revenue is that presumably in the first case you'd think of, the argument would be maybe the Russian government would subsidise the fixed costs. Perhaps in the second case, the consuming, you know, Japan or China would have more of an interest.
Yes.
And so I was just curious to know where you saw the source of the divergence between social benefit and commercial benefit.
Yes, so you agree that the pipeline implies great social benefits. Not only a very apparent one, which can be expressed in the corporate accounting system. But in case we let the private sectors to go for that projects, we can just count in what we can say according to the corporate accounting system. But we cannot incorporate the values of the social benefits into that investment decision. That's the important point. The second thing is that I think the $2 or $3 per barrel tariff will be commercially viable when it costs the competitive transportation cost to Europe. And the oil companies may be willingly pay that amount, but at the outset to make the investment decision, that it is very difficult for us to assure the financiers that we can surely get this amount, that amount. But the technical cost or actual cost, if we calculate, it is about $1, just $1. You know. So finally, the pipeline tariff will become in the range of $2 or $3, and the cost is $1. So government can just push it back. Go ahead. And of course, the raising fund is another big issue, but the Russian, Japanese, Chinese, and Korean governments can cooperate. They will have World Bank, we have Asian Development, and so many financial functions to carry out the sort of the social infrastructure projects. Why don't you go for that function? Is it the right answer for you?
That's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Other comments, questions? Well, you guys are gonna get a really long coffee break.
I have a question for Dr. Zhu. If the first priority of China is pipeline redacking, what about the Sinopec demand? Is going to be covered by the Middle Eastern oil and gas?
Sinopec.
Yeah.
Sinopec should be not involved in the transportation from China.
Now, when we talk about China as a whole, you talk about CNPC connection to Russia, but what about Sinopec region, which is actually expected to be much more higher growth in demand?
But in Russian area, Sinopec doesn't have any business need to stay there. But they may have some of the business in the southern China to represent the market in relation with the Russian side.
Oh, I mean, if you're talking solely about CNPC side. Okay.
Because CNPC totally, is Chinese representative negotiate with the Russian side on the transportation shipment oil from Russia to China.
So, but let me ask you a question about that, because if you have the refineries in Daiqing in northern China, Chinese production is not going to go to zero, right? And so the increase in the need for import, I think this is what you're getting at, is going to be in the southern part of China. In other words, the domestic crude that's being produced by China, even though it's declining, will still be able to meet much of the refinery demand in the northern China. And so, in a way, even though it's a more expensive project to go to Nakhodka or out to Dalian, right, it seems to me that the buyers inside China that would actually want Russian crude are not going to be the northern refineries.
There's already a line from Daqing to Dalian.
To Dalian, right.
Yeah.
But
If you
then,
get the crude to Daqing, it can basically displace the reduction in crude production at Daqing, right?
right, but I mean, is the reduction going to be so large that those refineries we're going to have to import?
Yeah, it's Daqing is now is a production there. Actually, Daqing is a big oil field in China now.
Right.
But the production from the field is going down.
Right.
I mean, so much so that
Yeah,
there'll
it's
be a
going
million
down.
barrels a day that's needed.
For sustainable, production, that's where CNPC plan let this the output down every year. Yeah, by importing the oil
From Russia.
Doesn't
to
a
meet
lot of
the
the
refinery
production,
there.
doesn't a lot of the production from Daqing go down to Dalian and get put on boats from there and go to other?
Yeah. Just that's also
Refineries as it is already.
because this is a pipeline
surely it'd be
already.
cheaper
It
just to bring
exists
it
the
in the Middle
pipeline
East
from
and get
Daqing
that.
down to Dalian also, then ship down to.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out what the balance numbers are. In other words, I don't know, how much crude is now being refined in northern China? What, do you know the volume off the top of your head?
In the north,
Yeah,
in the northern China, almost one third of the total of the country. Is a two-thirds.
One third of refining capacity of the
In
country.
north, yeah, especially in the northeast part.
Okay, and right now, none of that is being serviced by imports, right? It's all domestic Chinese crude.
Because this is mainly, is a source of oil.
Okay, so say that that's, I forget what Chinese consumption is, like 5 million barrels a day? So one third, so you're talking about 2
Yeah, one third,
million,
yeah.
so you're talking about 2 million, 1.5 to 2 million,
Consumption there is a 4 million.
4 million barrels a
Barrel
day.
per day, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
okay, so that's much more than production, yeah.
Two-thirds is the coastline, southern coastline.
Right.
From what I've heard, that the pricing formula that was being considered for valuing the crude coming from Russia would be the alternative of importing it from the Middle East. I mean, so basically, that would be the price-setting mechanism for the Russian crude, less the transportation costs.
Because it never was clear to me why it wouldn't make any sense. I mean,
Yeah, I think
you might want to just
when
continue,
Ron
you
and
might want to
I,
continue importing stuff and stop, at least part
yeah,
of it.
when Ron and
Middle
I,
East.
when Ron and I fooled with the numbers from Taran Basin compared to just bringing Middle East crude to the south, you needed about $14 WTI to justify bringing Taran Basin crude to coastal China to refine instead of Middle East crude. In other words, if the price was below $14 WTI, it didn't make sense to do. Above, depending on how many dollars above.
And that was leaving, what kind of net back into, that was basically getting
Just cutting your, covering your costs.
no return.
No return, right, no return.
Well, I mean, the crude that you're talking about is landlocked in Siberia as it is, so it's going a long way.
Yeah, whichever
to get
way it
exported.
goes,
So you're
right.
bringing it into, and you're basically having to build an additional line to Daqing, but once you get to Daqing, you're basically tying into infrastructure that's already existing.
My main
Yeah.
point is it's very important to disaggregate. I mean, a country like China is a very big country. You know what I mean? It's very, you have to, you gotta be careful about looking at it as sort of a big box with all coming in,
Right.
It's big, and there may be an eventual system where, there'll be some from the Middle East coming in at the south, it'll be depending on the relative costs. But there is a tendency sometimes, I think, in the business to look and say, oh, there's a big black box, we call that China. And
Well, see, yeah,
the
what I-
situation's much more complicated. as
Well,
you-
see, what
as
I
you
was
generally
trying to
know.
address is whether, if there's 1.5 million barrels of refining demand in northern China, and Chinese crude production is going to stabilize at 2 million barrels a day, and that 2 million barrels a day is located near the 1.5 million barrels a day of demand, why would you bring the Russian crude there?
It still could be cheaper to bring it down from Russia and Daqing to Dalian and put it on a boat than to bring it all the way around.
I see,
Of
okay.
course, the
From the
pipeline
Middle East.
should make sense.
Right.
You know, oil from Russia still is cheaper than
So-
the produced even in the north or in Daqing, you know, because the production there is down, cost is high.
So you're
The same
still gonna
with
bring
the
crude,
oil
some
from
crude is
west.
gonna move from Dalian by boat down to southern China, under any scenario,
Scenario.
right? So you're not actually, I mean, because a lot of times when people present this pipeline, they make it sound like it's economical because you're coming right to the refineries at
Yeah, it's a big- once
Daiqing,
again,
but that's
it's
not
the
really
black hole.
is.
Remember, it's the
Yeah,
black-
yeah, it's not that really.
Yeah, before China went into a net importing mode, they were basically, a lot of the production at Daqing would go down to Dalian and get on boats and.
Yeah, go to
go
Japan or
to
something
Japan.
like that, yeah.
Right, so I mean, that part of the infrastructure has already been set up and it's
Right.
not being utilized right now.
It's interesting though, because you're really talking about, is it more, does it really make sense to bring that crude all the way from Russia, or is there some closer source to bring to southern China by boat from some other place?
It's coming from the Middle East right now.
Right,
I don't know if it's closer. I mean, in theory, the supply costs in the Middle East should be lower.
right.
Once again, that.
Yeah, but that's
doesn't work that
OPEC,
way. The
yeah, it's
supply-
OPEC related, yeah,
That's
it's
OPEC
OPEC
related.
related, right,
The price of oil would be $10 a barrel if we.
right, right.
Again, I think the Dalian seaport is playing a similar role like the Nahodka.
Right,
Because
right,
there,
right.
Gas to their port, we can sell it anywhere,
Right,
especially in Asia, but it's really by, tank, so nearby market.
But one point for China, from strategic view, that if crude oil comes only from Nahodka, that all tankers have to go through every channels controlled by the United States.
at Nahodka or at Dalian or both?
If the pipeline goes down to Darien, the pipeline will be totally controlled by China.
Right.
That's correct.
But if all the
This
crude
is
oil
some
has
different.
to be shipped from Nahodka,
Nahodka port in Chinese.
the totally the scenario is different.
Right.
So in other words, China would presumably be prepared to pay a premium then.
Yeah,
For
right.
Russia, a security premium. for Russian oil.
But the market in China.
That only
make
works,
much more
by the way,
sense
that only
because,
works,
you
that
know,
only works if there's no other way for Eastern Siberian oil, the Siberian oil to get out.
Get out, right.
Because
Exactly.
we discovered that during the 73 oil crisis when our good buddy pal, the Shan Shah, screwed us like everybody else. So I'd warn the Chinese, be very careful about this, right? These good suppliers can turn on you when there's a crisis.
But the market in China is a very clear characteristic. Number one is big. Number two is stable. This quite makes sense that the Russian they are very comfortable. Oil can to China consumed in China locally. Very guarantees their return.
Well, the interesting thing from the Russian perspective is that if there is a connection made between West Siberia and East Siberia,
They can move it.
they can make a choice. Because
right.
depending on whether you have excess capacity going west, you have the possibility of reversing your flow and putting East Siberia through West Siberia. Right? So it
Yes.
is kind of an interesting question as to whether or not it's feasible or valuable to connect those two production areas. Because some people have advocated that if you take West Siberia and connect it to East Siberia, that makes all the East Siberian pipeline routes more feasible because you don't have to worry if you don't find up reserves, you can just bring the West Siberian oil down. But there could be an advantage if you wanted to go in the other direction. You have this opportunity to reverse flows. You're talking about 30 years and you don't know what the trends are going to be.
Right, but there's a cost associated with.
Yeah, huge
giving you
cost.
that flexibility.
Yeah, huge
It's having
cost.
major pipelines in both directions.
Right.
And I guess one of the questions is, will Murmansk and the China pipeline, or the pipeline in the Hanka, both be able to be justified? Because they're both going to need significant resources to support those pipelines.
Well, and some
Especially if you're
people
talking about 2
argue
million
that they're
barrels a day.
mutually exclusive, that there's not enough resources.
Right.
For both
Will that
routes.
flexibility ever exist then? Are you going to have to make a choice? You're going to have to pick one route or the other and live with it.
Right. But what I'm hearing from Candy is the US doesn't care as long as the oil's produced and coming to market.
Well, the Murmansk would certainly give the Russians greater flexibility. I mean, that's the one thing we
that's
can
right.
certainly say, much greater flexibility in a crisis.
That's right.
And it's a shorter, cheaper route. I mean, there's no question.
Yeah.
But what
If
it-
I were the
yeah,
Russians.
but once again, the Pacific Basin is probably where the supply deficit exists the
Absolutely.
most.
Absolutely.
And secondly, if you go Murmansk, you have the issue of, it's much more difficult to monetize the East Siberian resources. because-
Absolutely.
So, I mean, you got two, competing issues here.
No, I mean, it's a,
Yeah, Ron and I looked at it in looking at this whole question of Saudi price discrimination, because the question is, how much Russian oil comes into Europe, and would that displace some Middle Eastern crude that would then go and compete with Saudi crude in Asia? Then maybe it'd be harder for the Saudis to be the dominant player in Asia, right? If Russian oil forced out more Middle East oil, and especially if sanctions were lifted.
At a minimum, it would flood the European markets and push down the European price. So even if there was a premium, the price in
Right.
the Pacific Basin would still go down. But I don't know whether or not it would actually
Yeah,
get
I
rid
mean,
of the premium.
Yeah, you have to figure that it's gonna the crude's gonna be backed out somewhere, maybe come to the US, I mean, if
It's a
there's,
world oil market.
right, right. Martha?
I wanted to pick up your point about the development of East Siberian crude, and that you don't get that incentive in the same way if you don't go to Nakhodka. And that's really, in a sense, the strength of the Russian government argument that the state can't get totally out of the oil business. And I would say it's the weakness of the U.S. government argument that the state should get totally out of the oil business. that it's not a question of going one way or another. Transparency doesn't necessarily solve Russia's developmental challenges that they face. That's not arguing against transparency, but their main bottom line on their most statesman-like days really are the questions of juggling the competing developmental interests with the reassertion of Russian geopolitical position, with maximizing Russia's global position. And no amount of arguing by the U.S. government, or I would think by American corporations, is going to change that mindset, because in a sense, they understand the fragility of the asset that they're working with, that they get one crack at using it, and slowing development is not necessarily a bad strategy. Slowing development buys time and keeps you from making mistakes. But the viewpoint of an American corporation is going to be different if they come in, that they have commercial imperatives that are totally different from the kinds of developmental imperatives of a Russian government.
Well,
It doesn't have to, it need not conflict, but they're not going to be willing to give all of it over to somebody else.
well, chances are any specific private interest may not view it from the perspective of what's in the best interest of the country as a whole in the long term. They're going to look at, I don't have any assets in East Siberia, so I don't care if East Siberia doesn't get developed. That's not my problem.
And if I have assets in East Siberia,
Siberia.
and if I have assets in East Siberia, I want to make sure that my assets
Right.
get developed before everybody else's, and if that means that other people's won't get developed at all, and it
Yeah.
screws 3 oblasts, that's in the end.
Yeah, and
not
I
my
might even oppose a pipeline to West Siberia, saying, hey, there'll be no incentive to get this stuff developed out here if we open it
Well,
up
that's
to the
right.
West. I mean, it cuts all different ways.
Yeah,
And
if
in-
they're viewed as mutually exclusive
Yeah.
opportunities, you
Yeah.
most definitely will.
And it was interesting in June when we had the seminar in Moscow, Kaluzhny made the point, and he took it to the whole level of just export routes in general, because the private companies, Russian and American, tend to emphasize that there's not going to be enough pipeline capacity. So TNK had this spectacular presentation that showed you what everybody's 5-year plan was for each field they own, and how the Transneft's pipeline plan was not going to accommodate that. And you were going to have shut-in crude, and here's how many billions of dollars, the Russian government is going to be lacking. And, Kaluzhny stood up and said, he didn't have a chart, but he said, well, Russian refining capacity is operating at 67%. And he had this cake analogy that we can't just let, the oil companies eat the cake, right? We have to have food for everybody. And his point was that it's not in the Russian government's interest not to have the refining system running at 95% of capacity, that these refineries are located in different regions, and some of those regions have economic problems, right? And maybe even fuel shortages, right? And that the Russian government's job was to promote economic development across the country, right? And that was a better priority or a bigger priority than just getting the cake of the earnings for one particular company to export more crude.
Well, some of the location, my understanding, is the location of the refineries was based on that, is spreading the economic development and wealth. It was not
Right.
a optimistic
Absolutely.
location
No.
for refineries. It was spreading it around.
Yeah, it's like those brandy factories in Kyrgyzstan. They bring the
They
grapes
make good
from the
brandy,
Caucasus
though.
to make the brandy in Kyrgyzstan.
But, I mean, on the counter side, though, if you keep policies in place that encourage, that help create a situation where oil sells for $6 a barrel domestically into those refineries, you're not doing anything to encourage, more, a healthier change or shift in energy consumption policies and industrial policies and whatever. So I understand the argument, or we understand the argument that, yes, you want to keep those people employed, but you also, there's other costs that you're
But they vote.
engendering by that that are pretty severe too.
No, they really do. They do vote. Why do we keep farm subsidies?
Yeah.
Yeah, why did we let Cancun die on $3 billion worth of cotton subsidies to 25,000 American farmers? Well, I'm not blaming you for that. No, but I mean, we killed Cancun
Yeah.
on cotton subsidies.
Governments do not make decisions necessarily on economic benefit.
No, and then also because they have this problem in Russia, maybe less so than we have here in the United States. I mean, you do have this huge disparity between the economic class of people living in Moscow, right, and the economic class of people living in some of these regions, right? So that you could paint, if I were Ron, I would paint that $6 oil price as a government spread of subsidy stimulation, right? In other words, this part of my country is economically not well off, so they're going to have a low energy price so they can develop.
Well, I've seen that $6 price. I mean, it's fluctuated tremendously. It's unbelievable how much the domestic price fluctuates. But I don't believe that the price that the consumer pays when they buy petrol or fuel oil is
Related to
anything to
that?
do with $6 a
You
barrel.
think
That
that-
$6 barrel has more to do with the fact that the domestic market is so thinly traded, because you have basically integrated oil companies that are basically feeding their own refineries with their own, their own crude. And a lot of, I think, what happens has to do with transfer pricing. And the transfer pricing has more to do with it. But I think the actual markets for domestic crude is so thin that that's why it can be $15 one
Yeah,
month,
one
and
day,
2 months
yeah.
later it's down to $5. But I don't think that the consumer is actually benefiting from that price when it's at $5 or $6 a barrel.
They're paying 1/4 the price for fuel oil that we pay in Russia.
For the fuel oil for heat?
For heat, they're paying less than that, and for petrol, they're paying approximately 1/4. For
Well,
heat, they're paying
it doesn't show up
100.
that way now if you go to a gas station in any of the Russian cities that I've been
Depends
It
what
looks like
we-
it's about the same price. Wholesale gasoline prices seem to be equivalent to what they are here, in the States. From what I've seen.
Depends on where you go for your gas then. I mean, it's,
Well, I'm sure there may be some areas that are underprivileged that might be more subsidized, but certainly in Moscow and many of the major cities, it doesn't seem to be that. I haven't seen that. Yeah, our refiners haven't seen that.
As far as I know, the gas in Moscow is more expensive than in the United States.
fuel oil, petrol.
Yeah, gas, petrol is more expensive than here in Moscow.
But it was 1/4 of what Western Europe was when I checked it.
Well, I'm-
That's good.
But what's,
Yeah.
yes, four times what the US is.
But what is the global price? It's like, what is it?
I think,
What should that $6 translate into? It is 1/4 of what Western Europeans pay for this.
I don't know
thing.
where,
The Western
what's
Europeans.
the origin of this figure, because the gas prices in the regions are higher sometimes than in Moscow. So So if you live in Vladivostok or Khabarovsk, you have to pay more for gas compared with prices in Moscow.
Well, then that is the opposite of what I'm saying, so then that doesn't make any sense. And that just means that some refining company executives making a lot of money and then coming to Moscow to go shopping.
Well, it's transfer
It's a
pricing.
transfer pricing.
Right.
We know that there's transfer pricing going on. I mean,
Yeah.
there's reasons for that. And there are tax-free zones that Russian companies take advantage of and basically force the profits into these zones that
Yeah.
have very low taxation rates. And they do that via transfer pricing. But at basic, even at $30 a barrel, I mean, the wholesale price of gasoline isn't really much more than 90 cents a barrel to $1 a barrel. The reason Western Europe is so high is they tax it at a rate which is 300%. So but I don't think when the price is $6 a barrel that the Russians or consumers are benefiting from that. I think it's kind of like a more of a just
Producers.
transparency.
Right.
No pun intended.
Okay, shall we take a short coffee break? 6?